This is the second part of our lecture on ear of the other. In the first part, we looked at some foundational concepts to enable us to be able to better understand the ear of the other. And in the second part, we're now going to actually turn our attention to the text of ear of the other and look at some carefully selected passages from it. There's a lot in this text and in the interviews that follow. We can't do every aspect of it, but we'll try to identify some really key, important aspects of this text, which we said in a previous lecture. We discussed how Derrida deconstructs the concept of the animal. In this case, we're looking at Derrida's deconstruction of the university. Now, as I said previously, he has many other texts in which he's deconstructed the university. This is only one small instance of this. And I think it's one of the more provocative aspects of his work is the interventions that he made on behalf of the university and thinking about what it meant to be a professor in a university. And so we see him here looking to the early thought of Nietzsche on the future of the educational institutions, which Nietzsche wrote in his mid-20s, and then later, Thus Spake Zarathustra, which Nietzsche wrote at a later, some years later after he had left the university, but meditating on the university and on the question of the university, which Nietzsche saw as being in his time degenerative, which is one of the reasons why he walked away from it. So Derrida is going to affirm some aspects of Nietzsche's deconstruction of the university as being relevant in our time, although he's going to be critical of certain other aspects which could arguably link Nietzsche to the ideology of National Socialism, which emerged many years after these texts were written, but some that then they appropriated his name. This leaves Derrida with certain questions about Nietzsche's deconstruction of the university. But Derrida is going to affirm certain aspects of the way that Nietzsche approaches this deconstruction of the university. Okay, so here you can see Avital Ronell. She is the translator of Ear of the Other. I'm a translator myself. I like to draw attention to translators. They do a great service on our behalf. But Ronell has written some really wonderful works in her own right. And I urge you to have a look, particularly at Stupidity. I feel that is her most significant work to date. But she's done important work since then as well. And she was closely associated with Derrida. Okay. So as I said previously, if we think of Nietzsche as a philosopher who, walked away from the university and washed his hands of the university, in part because he saw it as being compromised by its relationship to the state, to what he's going to call in Thus Spake Zarathustra, the cold, cruel beast that is the state. But if we think of, let's say, Kant, who precedes Nietzsche, Kant was really the first sort of public philosopher, and his liberal philosophy really develops as a consequence of his being within the university and being a servant of the state. His book Conflict of the Faculties, which Derrida and especially has written on and discussed at length in some of his texts on the university, is really a classic for anybody interested in the question of the university. Kant really inaugurates what the notion of the university as we inherit it today. And Derrida, you'll find Derrida in his response to Kant, wondering if Kant's take on the university and the liberal arts, let's say, educational system, educational institution, is if it remains valid today, or if the technologies, like, let's say, this kind of technology with which I'm delivering this talk, if these kinds of technologies have totally exploded the very idea of the university. And just, you can just think of one instance of this. I mean, think about, I've heard it said, that these lectures I'm delivering in the context of the coronavirus. Well, what happens to a university when it's no longer a place, when, say in an ontological sense, where bodies are gathered together in the same space and time? do we need a university even in the same way that we that we've come to think of the university as we inherit it from Kant? Perhaps this what we're going through now, it remains to be seen how it may transform our very idea of the university. And so, but these questions were anticipated in the thought of Derrida in his response to Kant. And so here in this text, The Ear of the Other, he's deconstructing the university, but really it's just a brief beginning. You can find he did a vast amount of work on this question in other texts like Eyes of the University and Who's Afraid of Philosophy, texts I really always recommend, particularly if you're a graduate student who's thinking through your place in the institution as you're becoming more and more deeply affiliated with institutions. It's a really great way to reading these texts, are a great way to kind of problematize one's position within the university and to asking, well, what actually is a university? And we'll see Derrida can say, well, it's something that is inaugurated. And as such, it can be deconstructed, but that also means affirmation, which means each inauguration implies a renewal of what was inaugurated when the university was first instituted, for whatever reason it was instituted. Like say here in Western Washington, where I teach, the university's been here some 120 years. Well, a particular group of people got together and instituted it for particular reasons. And that's so institution in that sense, the way that Derrida is going to think of it, it is an event that takes place. It's not just a set of buildings or a particular structure. And that event of the institution of the university has to continually be renewed. Now, Heidegger, we saw in his case, this was, he was compromised by the way that he, even as profound as his thought is, his actions as a professor, as rector at the University of Freiburg, when he so closely affiliated himself with the Third Reich, really did jeopardize his, that it really does, tarnish his legacy. And although he was allowed to return to teach in 1951, after being banished for a few years, he never was able to, they didn't allow him to assume any position of responsibility within the university other than teaching lectures. And it's often have been noted that in this period when Heidegger could not teach, it was a very painful period for him because he saw himself as a teacher of students and as a professor who was housed within universities. So that's the question that Derrida is going to be asking in his deconstruction of the universities. He's going to be thinking about the university as an institution, the place of the professor within that institution. Okay, so he'll start now. He's going to start with this really funny quote from Thus Spake Zarathustra. Nietzsche's language is always very provocative, poetic, and Zarathustra is this figure in this text. He's like this. He's this figure who goes and meditates, and then he goes into retreat for a while and meditates, and then he founds this new doctrine, which is going to be linked to this idea of the doctrine of eternal return that he founds. And when he leaves the cave and he comes out after having sort of come to some of the conclusions that he's come to, he looks about at those who are that he sees, and one of the persons that he first sees is a professor, a professor who's believed to be a very great professor. And then, but Nietzsche gives us a kind of a cartoonistic caricature of this professor that Zarathustra sees when he leaves his cave. So let's read what Nietzsche's language is. He says, "There are human beings who lack everything except one thing of which they have too much. Human beings who are nothing but a big ear or a big mouth or a big belly. Inverse cripples, I call them. When I, Zarathustra, crawled out of my solitude and crossed over this bridge for the first time, I did not trust my eyes. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. And I looked and looked again and said at last, an ear as big as a man. I looked still more closely, and indeed there was something moving, something pitifully small and wretched and slender. And no doubt of it, the tremendous ear was attached to a small, thin stalk. but this stalk was a human being. If one used a magnifying glass, one could even recognize a tiny, envious face. Also, that a bloated little soul was dangling from his stalk. The people, however, told me that this great ear was not only a human being, but a great one, a genius. All right, so the professor in this account is nothing but an enormous ear. Okay, now we said in the previous lecture the ear is a kind of a vaginal image. It's the place where the seed that is, let's say if we think of the seed as semen, as a spoken word, that's expectorated from the mouth. The logos in the Platonic sense when he speaks of, it bearing fruit, or in the Christian parable of the sower who sows seeds. So the word is, it's construed here as a kind of a seed that I spit from the mouth into the ear of the other, which is a kind of a vaginal image. And so in this deconstruction, again, it's not coincidental that choreographies, which is Derrida's, really, I feel it's his one of his most significant, certainly, pieces on responding to the question of feminism and feminist theory. It's no accident that it's included in this text, because he's thinking about this question of the ear. Okay, and one of the things he's going to be concerned with is recuperating what he's going to call the living maternal, which is, again, also a choral link to the question of Cora as well, and what the Cora is. But here we have a professor who's just nothing but a huge ear. Okay, so let's work with that for just a bit, and let's see what Derrida says. Okay, so he's going to say, Derrida's critique of this is going to say, the ear is at stake in teaching and its institutions. And as you know, everything gets wound up in Nietzsche's ear and the motifs of his labyrinth. Okay, now there's a little picture down below. I recommend those of you who haven't read it to read Apuleius's The Golden Ass. You can think of the ass, the man who gets turned into an ass, like Bottom in Shakespeare, and one gets turned into an ass when one's, it's a matter of, exploring this novel by Apuleius, written 100 years or so after Christ, explores one's, basic questions of one's animality. But the idea of our animality is that our ears grow as we become curious, as does, say, Lucius in the Apuleius tale. But here's Nietzsche playing around with this idea of what it means, to be an ass. He's going to say, as we all know from experience what a long-eared beast the ass is. Well, then I dare to assert I have the smallest ears. I am the anti-ass par excellence, and thus a world historical monster. Okay, so unlike this professor who's a great big ear, he's the anti-ear, the anti-ass. He has very small, finely tuned ears. Okay, now we said with respect to the visor effect that the visor, is like an eyelid. You open an eye, you open it, you shut it. You open it, you shut it. And and Derrida's going to urge us in his writing on the university. He's going to say, you got, like, he had this, well, from his personal experience, he had a time where one of his eyes, he couldn't shut it. It was like, the eyelid wouldn't shut, and so consequently his eye got really all dried out. It was very painful. I think, I'm guessing it was very painful for him, but it caused him, again, to reflect on the importance of tears, and the importance of one of the reasons why we close our eyes is to wet our lens. And this is he's going to link this idea to, he's going to say the professor shouldn't become what he calls a sclerophthalmic, insect, or a scarred-eyed insect, that we should, some insects, like, they don't blink, they just stare, and this is what we shouldn't be as faculty, as professors, as philosophers. We shouldn't, we sometimes, he's going to say, even talk about what we're going to call cultivating the art of blinking. Well, sometimes we need to blink, as into, to wet the eyelids so that we see, not, in the Cartesian sense, with lucidity and clarity, but maybe with compassion. We don't, like, for instance, if we're thinking about, or if we're writing about or studying, human beings, well, we don't, say in Said's Orientalist sense, we don't want to think of a human being as just some kind of dead insect that we're studying, or like what Chomsky's going to say, that the Martian scientist studies the fruit fly, and that's how we should approach the study of our fellow, human beings, and that's precisely what Derrida is not saying. But if we can close our eyes, and we have to and should close our eyes, and that's linked to the question of compassion. The ears, you can't close them, right? I mean, they're always open, okay? And so if you're a student, think of this, if you're a student in the university and you're walking around, there's a lot of wicked winds that can blow through the air. There's a lot of garbage that circulates, bad ideologies, bad ideas, craziness from every direction. And so, so the question is are you going to open your ears to every wicked wind that wafts your way, or are you going to close your ears and have, like, Nietzsche is going to say, I have very small, finely tuned ears. Now maybe I can't close them all the way, like I can close my eyes, but I don't want to turn myself into an ass. I don't want to be an ass with long ears. I want to have small, finely tuned ears, which is to say, I want to be careful about spirit. I want to be careful about some of that wind that is blowing my way. And so that's what he's saying here. He is the anti-ass, and that makes him a kind of a world historical monster, because if you're a good, obedient student, well, you just should be like this professor who has this enormous ear, and just let it all blow. All right. Okay. Or let it all blow in. Okay. And here's again from Thus Spake Zarathustra. Nietzsche says, if some foreigner wanted to know, it was not from a different land, they came and they wanted to know something about our university, first thing he would ask is, how is the student connected with the university? And we answer, by the ear, as a listener. And the foreigner is astonished. Only by the ear? He repeats, only by the ear, we again reply. The student listens. Very often the student writes as he listens. And it is only at these moments that he hangs by the umbilical cord of the university. Okay, so in Nietzsche's reckoning, what makes you a student is your ear that listens, and the university has you by the ear. It's got you grabbed by the ear. And so you hold up your ear to all these winds that are blowing your way, and you write down what you hear. And it is in this way that you are connected to the university by a kind of umbilical cord. Okay, the university has you by the ear. Okay, so here's Derrida's commentary. Dream this umbilicus, this umbilical cord. The university has you by the ear. It is an ear, however, that dictates to you what you are writing at this moment. That would be me. I would be the ear if I were this professor. I would be an ear dictating to an ear. As you are writing down the words that you hear. When you write in the mode of what is called taking notes, this writing links you, Derrida says, like a leash in the form of an umbilical cord. It's like a leash, like a dog being held on a leash, but it's an umbilical cord to the paternal belly of the state. Okay, so now the state, again, we're going to see, is the cold, cruel monster. Nietzsche is going to say the Leviathan. And but you have a kind of an umbilical cord that, the writing that you write down, the doctrines that you absorb, let's say the politically correct doctrines, the thinking of the day that you absorb by opening your ears to these winds that blow and then writing it down. This is what is going to connect you to the paternal belly of the state. Okay, so now this is very strange because your umbilical cord doesn't connect you to your father, it connects you to your mother. But in Derrida and Nietzsche's reading, both the state, wants to be both mother and father, even though the state is more of the order of law, or a matter of law. This, the social contracts, laws that are articulated in social contracts that bring into being the res publica when one vows to affirm the res publica or the republic. Nonetheless, the state is a father that wants to be a mother in this description, but you're bound to it as a kind of a like a baby to with an umbilical cord to this Leviathan. Your pen is its pen. You hold its teleprinter like one of those big ballpoints attached by a little chain in the post office. And I think we've all seen those, that your pen is not a free pen, although you may imagine that you have academic freedom. It's within the context of this dictating procedure that takes place and is within the institution that is monitored by the state or by the cold, cruel beast or the Leviathan. You may pay heed to the fact that the omphalos, or the belly button, that Nietzsche compels you to envision resembles both an ear and a mouth. It has the invaginated folds and the involuted orificality of both. So think of your belly button as a kind of a vagina, or as a kind of an ear, as a kind of a mouth. And it's this is also, again, something that is connecting you to this cold, cruel beast. Now, this may give us some indication of why Nietzsche walked away from the institution, and why Derrida also has some. I mean, it's not that he's skeptical about academic freedom. He says, you can take it or leave it. But is the freedom that we experience within the university, the so-called freedom that we experience, is it really free at the end of the day, or is it controlled by the state, or at least we know the state is silently observing, watching what, in the same way that Hamlet's father is also a kind of Leviathan, as well as insofar as it's conjured by the three conspirators in Shakespeare's play. But this Leviathan, this state, is overseeing what we call, freedom of speech or free exchange, the ability to freely discuss concepts within the institution. I'm sure we can all agree that, a lot of times when you're in a classroom setting, you know very well that your freedom of speech is not all that free. It's governed by all kinds of concerns. There's a great amount of things that cannot be said in the institution, and we know that that's not that may make us uncomfortable, but it's not. It's simply a matter of fact. Okay, so Nietzsche's going to say, as for the professor, he speaks to these listening students. Whatever else he may think or do is cut off from the student's perception by an immense gap. Okay, so what's going on in the professor's private life? It's like that he's a mouth that speaks, but also a mouth that is an ear, and he comes and he goes, and there's this as in the teaching of competencies, which I spoke about earlier. There is a gap between the student and the professor. That's part of what happens in this listening and speaking operation. Now, the professor often reads when he is speaking, as I am reading now. As a rule, he prefers to have as many listeners as possible. Right now, this is very different from the Nietzschean, on the future of our educational institutions, when you have this old professor who doesn't want students, who finds them to be kind of pesky and annoying, and he doesn't want as many listeners as possible. He'll settle for one or two really good listeners, but one or two people who are capable of learning, but he's not interested in attracting as many people as possible to the institution. And Nietzsche questions, this very dimension of education, democratic educational institution. It's desire to attract as many listeners as possible, to keep the machine functioning. In the worst cases, he makes do with just a few ears, a few students, and rarely with just one speaking mouth with many ears and half as many writing hands. There you have, to all appearances, the external academic apparatus. There you have the university culture machine. So in one sentence, you got one mouth that speaks, you got a lot of ears, and you have half as many writing hands, because you write with one hand, but you always have two ears that are listening, and that's what the university culture machine is in this description. Okay, now here's our image from, we've seen this before when we talked about Hobbes's Leviathan. You can see there the res publica, the Leviathan. So Nietzsche calls it a cold, cruel beast. He's not just, wanting to, be critical of the university by calling it a beast. He's describing it in terms of what the res publica is, which is in fact a leviathan. It's an artificial creature made by man, called into being by man, conjured by man, and it is Derrida will describe it as a kind of a prosthetic, like a wooden leg, for instance. But it is because it's not a living beast. It's more akin to a machine, but it is a beast. You could think of it as in Hobbesian terms as a kind of a dangerous beast as well, because it has the law, which is always again a matter of force and violence, or that we could say, as we said in our discussion of Kant, that the concept of the law is interdependent with the concept of violence, or its forceful application. There is no law that's not backed up with force, and so this cruel, cold beast is not to be trifled with. This is a dangerous beast who's watching over our listening and speaking operation. Okay, so Nietzsche will say, state, what is that? Well, this is the Leviathan, but here's what he says. He says, well, then open your ears to me. State is the name of the coldest of all cold monsters. Coldly, it tells lies too, and this lie crawls out of its mouth. I, the state, am the people. That is a lie. State, I call it where all drink poison, the good and the wicked. State, where all lose themselves, the good and the wicked. State, where the slow suicide of all is called life. Okay, so this may give you some indication of why Nietzsche didn't want to be an employee of the state, let's say in the way that Kant, as a public professor and philosopher, was an employee of the state, and as Heidegger and Derrida were as well. But this also may give you some indication of why why Derrida was so concerned with the deconstruction of the university and thinking about its relationship to the state. Okay, so here's where Derrida says in his commentary, not only is the state marked by the sign and paternal figure of death, it also wants to pass itself off for the mother, that is, for life, the people, the womb of things themselves. This hypocritical hound, this state, whispers in your ears through his educational systems. You become indoctrinated. Your ears grow larger and you turn into long-eared asses when instead of listening with small, finely tuned ears and obeying the best master and the best of leaders, you think you are free and autonomous with respect to the state. You open wide the portals of your ears to admit the state, not knowing that it has already come under the control of reactive and degenerative forces. Is this our situation? It is a question of the ear. Okay, now let's back up here just a minute, because Derrida is going to draw attention to the fact that he's going to say instead of listening when he says to the to the best master and the best of leaders, you think you're free and autonomous. Well, Derrida is going to be voice his skepticism about the free and autonomous discourse that takes place within the institution that is overseen by the state. He's just going to say, again, take it or leave it, free speech, but he's going to also draw attention to the fact that this idea of the best, instead of following or obeying the best master and the best of leaders. Remember, again, in German, this is Führer, and this is a dimension of Nietzsche's discourse that was, that Heidegger certainly, agreed with when he dismissed the faculty, most of the philosophy faculty, and construed himself as that, master, that best master, that Führer, that guide to lead, the university. And also, but of course, we know that Hitler appropriated this discourse as well. So the discourse of National Socialism and Heidegger will echo the discourse of Nietzsche in this respect. Doesn't mean that Nietzsche again would have affirmed what the Nazism or what Heidegger's affiliation with the Third Reich, but clearly there we can find these resonances in the discourse of Nietzsche, and this is something that Derrida is not going to ignore, but in fact draw our attention to. Okay, now. Let me just take a moment here. We're going to focus now on this idea of the Nietzschean view of the self, So when we talk about we've talked about Dasein, this entity that we are, that Heidegger calls Dasein. And so and also we could think of the Nietzschean entity that we are as being, akin to Dasein in the sense, you think of the Apollonian, the Dionysian as being these two elements. But here we find a different way of articulating, what the sort of the self is. And he's speaking about his own self. He's speaking about it. He's sort of giving his own autobiography, in effect. And he's saying, I am the living mother. I am the dead father. Now, in his own personal life, Nietzsche's father was, in fact, dead. He died when Nietzsche was very young. And his mother was still alive. But he's going to say, I am both. I am both my living mother and I am my dead father. But this is also, linked to the idea of living mother and spirit, the idea of spirit being linked to the living mother, in addition to the choral abyss, and the dead father being linked to the paternal, law, the discourse that is already written, of social contracts, laws that are agreed upon when we enter into covenants or contracts that assume, as we said in the case of, we're talking about Kant and the categorical imperative and the maxim, is that it has to be written. It's an empirical external law that is articulated. And so the dead father is associated with the paternal law. So we can think also of, like, say in the Catholic tradition, Latin being a dead language that was spoken in the church for a long time, up until Vatican II in the 1950s. And so it became a kind of a dead language, although at one time it was not a dead language, but it became a dead language, and this is language of the law. So the father is associated with the dead language. The mother, we can think of this even in Lacanian terms too, if we wanted to, or as Julia Kristeva has explored, is the idea of the mother tongue, this relationship that happens with children, and this when Lacan calls the symbolic, the imaginary stage, which is that early stage where the mother has this very close relationship with the child. And so this is the maternal is Derrida is going to refer to this as the maternal debt, also in Spectres of Marx, and he's going to note that all revolutions have to sort of pass through the maternal. So we want to think about what is this living feminine? What does this mean? What is this this image of the maternal that is being affirmed here? But remember, Nietzsche is not like stigmatizing the dead father and affirming the living mother. He's saying he's both. He's the dead father and he's the living mother. He is the two. These two of them are who he is, both at one and the same time. And so he says, the good fortune of my existence, its uniqueness, perhaps lies in its fatality. Nietzsche says, I am, to express it in the form of a riddle, already dead as my father, while as my mother I am still living and becoming old. So there, that little riddle, there's an encapsulated phrase that can tell us something about what the Nietzschean self is. I'm as dead as my father, while as my mother I am still living and becoming old. Okay, so here's Derrida's gloss on this, or interpretation. He says, inasmuch as I am and follow after my father. Now note here too, as in our discussion of the animal, therefore I am, when I say inasmuch as I am, it's inasmuch as je suis and je suis after my father, right? So I am both, I just suis, I am, and I follow. It's both at the same time. It's not one or the other. I am the dead man and I am death. Inasmuch as I am and follow after my mother, I am life that preserves. I am the living and the living feminine. I am my father, my mother, and me who is my father, my mother, and me, my son and me, death and life, the dead man and the living feminine, and so on. There, this is who I am, a certain masculine and a certain feminine. You will not be able to hear and understand my name unless you hear it with an ear attuned to the name of the dead man and the living feminine, the double and divided name of the father who is dead and the mother who is living on. This double birth explains who I am. Okay, so pretty fascinating. Again, remember, we can think of the father as linked to the specter, the idea of specter, dead letters, and the mother, dead letters that also have a certain autonomy, of course, living dead letters, but dead in the sense that it's connected to the question of the law of the father, le nom de père in Lacanian terms, and the mother who is, again, linked to the question of spirit and the mother tongue. So mother goes sort of with spirit. Mother goes with spirit. Father goes with specter in this paradigm here, or in this image of the self that Nietzsche is describing. This double birth explains who I am. I'm the living father, the living mother, and the dead father. I'm both, okay? I am, and I demand a keen ear. I am the both, the double. I sign double. My writings, and I make two. I am the masculine dead, the living feminine, and I am destined to them. I come from the two of them. I address myself to them. How does the knot of all these considerations tie up with the tangled politics and policies in education? Now, this is the question that Derrida is raising. Okay, and here is his sort of thesis, in which he is effectively agreeing with Nietzsche about the question of the living feminine and what happens to the living feminine, not just in Nietzsche's day, but in our day today, and in institutions today. And here's Derrida. So this is Derrida's sort of thesis. And remember, Derrida, like Heidegger, very rarely asserts thesis, but here's a clear thesis. Today's teaching establishment perpetuates a crime against life, understood as the living feminine. Okay, so again, today's teaching establishment perpetuates a crime against life, understood as the living feminine. Disfiguration disfigures the maternal tongue. Profanation profanes its body, the mother tongue. This is the living language, the language of spirit, as opposed to Latin, a dead paternal language, the language of another law. Okay, now let's think about this, and let's say in relation to, I'll give you an example again. In the English department, says this is the example I mentioned previously, is that in an English department, first, if you study rhetoric in an English department, it's construed as written discourse, in effect, how to construct an argument persuasively that you can present and then persuade your reader. But the discourse is, in an English department, is predominantly a written discourse, and one studies rhetoric as a matter of written discourse. Now, rhetoric is linked to the idea of rhetor, the speaking arts. Rhetor is a speaker, rhetoric is speaking arts. But if you want to become a powerful speaker, you don't do that in English departments. You do that in a speech and communication department. Study, forensics and debate and so on. But why is it then that in a department of English that's about the English language is so focused on dead letters rather than living spirit? Okay, or what, say, someone like Allen Ginsberg would call it, spiritus, breath, or Jack Kerouac, as in jazz, blowings, that producing poetry was. You see this both in Kerouac and in Ginsberg, also in Walt Whitman, and say Bob Dylan as well. This idea of blowing in the wind, or spirit, is a matter of wind, and so this is a matter of the English language as a living language, a living heritage of the maternal mother, as opposed to having to always reading texts that are dead letters. Okay, so the inattentiveness to spoken discourse, spirit, is also a matter of inattentiveness to what Derrida here is calling the living maternal, which is always revolutionary and threatening to the paternal law, the system of the law. Okay. There has to be, Derrida is going to say, a pact or an alliance with the living language and the language of the living feminine against death, against the dead. The law of the mother as language is a domain, a living body, not to be sacrificed or given up dirt cheap. Okay, it's a precious resource, a precious inheritance, something that we remain indebted to and for all of our lives. The master must suppress the movement of this mistreatment. The master, let's say, of discourse, in this case we're talking about English, Nietzsche was talking about German, must suppress the movement of this mistreatment inflicted on the body of the mother tongue. He must learn to treat the living feminine correctly, okay? Or, as in the case of, Horatio, he's got to, speak to he has to give spirit to specter. He has to speak to the specter. And so this is the let's say the problem with that so many English people that major in English and go on to do studies in English or any sort of language-based program often encounter is that they're so wrapped up with the dead. They're so they've been inculcated with so many doctrines of the dead that they forget all about the living feminine, which would be again a matter of poetic spirit in this case. Okay, so this is what Nietzsche and Derrida are both in agreement on this. Okay, now when Derrida does not, as we said, he doesn't exonerate Nietzsche for the parts of his language, literature that can be so easily appropriated by fascism. He's not interested in clearing anybody of any charges or on the other hand, putting anybody on trial. He's basically going to say, it all depends on how you sign the text that you read. So we can think of the signature as like, circumcision. It's a cut or a name that is left on the body, of the other. But if we can think of the corpus of writings that are left behind, Nietzsche's going to say this as well. He say, look, some people are born posthumously. He meant himself. He knew that in his own time, he would be misunderstood. And he said, I think that's even, right, that because I don't want to be confused with others. And certainly this has been the case with Derrida as well. To be misunderstood is the fate that both Nietzsche and Derrida have shared. But really, whether or not you're, the Nietzsche that you construct, or it all depends on how you respond to his call and the mark that you leave upon the texts of Nietzsche that Nietzsche has left behind. So this is why you say, look, there can be a left Nietzsche, there can be a right Nietzsche, there can be a left Marx, a right Marx, a left Heidegger, a right Heidegger, and there could be a left Derrida and a right Derrida as well. It all depends on the signature that you leave upon the other whom you sign in the reading of the other. Okay, he says, I do not aim to clear Nietzsche and neutralize or diffuse either what might be troublesome for democratic pedagogy of leftist politics that doesn't interest Derrida, or what served as language for some of the most sinister rallying cries of National Socialism. But it would be just as peremptory to deny that something is going on here, which passes from the Nietzschean Führer, guide, master, who is not merely a school teacher and master of doctrine, to the Hitlerian Führer or guide, who also wanted to be taken for a spiritual and intellectual master. The example of Heidegger certainly does give us a fair amount to think about in this regard, and I think that's true. Now here's Derrida saying further. He says, there's nothing absolutely contingent about the fact that the only political regimen to have effectively brandished his name, Nietzsche's name, as a major and official banner was Nazi. Yet, however, but the future of the Nietzschean text is not closed. I do not believe that we know how to think what Nazism is. The task remains before us, and the political reading of the Nietzschean body or corpus is part of it. I would say the same is true for the Heideggerian, Marxian, or Freudian corpus, and for so many others as well. Now, this is a question of the archive, and so we can think of the Nietzschean archive, the Heideggerian archive, and as Derrida is going to say, there is a malaise, there's something mal in the archive, like an archive fever. There's because this is that idea of the volcanic, possibility of the eruptions that can occur within words, but whatever, archives, as Derrida is going to say, that their meaning is not a matter of understanding the past. Their meaning, lies in the future. And the same is true, really, of the Nietzschean archive. So simply because the Nazis appropriated and used it a particular way, it doesn't mean that the case is closed. There's we return to the texts and we read them in other ways. Okay. Questions for further consideration as we come to a conclusion. One question that we might want to ask, since we're thinking about the idea of the signature and how Nietzsche is signed, and how his meaning depends on how he's signed and who signs him and for what reasons. Let's ask the same question about the signature that Derrida leaves upon Marx. How does Derrida sign Marx, and how is the signature of Derrida upon Marx going to impact those, influenced by Marx? And then, why did Derrida wait so long to sign Marx when he made that deliberate decision to deconstruct Marx? What were the historical circumstances that caused him to delay signing the text of Marx? And then what caused him to finally make that decision? Why did he wait until after the worldwide collapse of Marxian socialism? How have Derrida's readers signed Derrida? Why are so many of the inscriptions left upon the corpus of Derrida so aggressive, reactionary, and violent, and false? What is it about the thought of Derrida that causes so much anxiety? Now, when I say false, it was Stanley Fish who said a strong misreading is sometimes, better than a weak correct reading. And so there's certainly some truth to that. And I don't want to suggest there is simply a correct and a false reading of Derrida, but I think there also is a question of, mischaracterization of his work, that it's one thing to leave a signature on a writer whom you don't like, but whom you've actually read. There's another just to make up falsehoods about about what is actually contained in the corpus of that writer's work, which then it does really a disservice, not just to, say, Derrida in this case, but but to all of those people who trust you, who give you credit when you make such claims. So what is it about the thought of Derrida that causes so much anxiety? Okay, so in future talks, we're going to we'll address specters of Marx. We're going to go very deeply into this question of Derrida's deconstruction of Marx and Marxism, and what it means, not just for those who lived at the time and who were present at the time that he made that decision to deconstruct Marx, but what it means for the future of Marx and Marxism and world politics today.